This boy William Adams hasn't aged in 400 years. Marty, how did you manage to do that?
It's through the power of whiskey, Justin. I keep telling you, whiskey makes things immortal. It doesn't go off. It doesn't age. It's just a wonderful product. Wonderful. It's the water of life, Justin. The water of life.
Stephen, what was it like working with James Clavell?
That's a excellent question. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity.
No, you aren't really. You're a Japanese whiskey guru.
A little bit of all Japanese spirits, I guess.
We are joined by Stephen Lyman of Honkaku Spirits in Japan. The reason he was flagged up to me is because they've brought out a new whiskey which has been award winning, and it's in a totally, well, it's not new. It's reviving a very brief experiment from a long time ago. Stephen, could you explain what I'm on about? Because I don't really know what I'm on about yet.
You don't know, Marty? That's incredible.
Yeah, so in the late 1800s, the Illinois Whiskey Trust had licensed a proprietary whiskey making method from a Japanese chemist who was living in Chicago at the time. And it was a maltless whiskey that was being made. And they were doing experiments. There was a mysterious fire in the building that was housing the experiments.
Is it
never explained.
By mysterious, do you mean arson?
Could have been.
Could have been, potentially.
Apparently the accelerants that were used in the fire just absolutely gutted the room where the experiments were taking place, and the rest of the building was relatively untouched.
By some miracle.
That's right. And so they did rebuild. They finished their experiments. They actually started production in 1894 at the Manhattan Distillery in Peoria, Illinois. Unfortunately, within 3 or 4 months after the production had begun, the distillery itself went into receivership. It was part of a whiskey trust, and this was the era of trust bust in the United States. And so when the new owners of the distillery took over, they decided to return to malted whiskey rather than this new Tagamine process.
Now, when you say maltless, just explain why that's important, because everyone's familiar with the term malt whiskey. So what does maltless mean?
Sure. So rather than using malted grains, which you would use in a malted whiskey, the grains are actually steamed and propagated with koji spores. So koji is a mold. It's actually the national mold of Japan.
I love that. I love the fact that Japan has a national mold.
Is this like your cult flavored whiskey?
I don't think so. The mold actually, it's not too much to say that there would not be Japanese cuisine as we know it without koji.
Yeah.
Soy sauce, miso, mirin, sake, these are all made from koji.
Yeah.
And so this Japanese chemist had actually, his mother was from a sake making family. So he had learned how to ferment rice to make alcohol. Obviously also a grain, but the difference in the way that the koji process works is you polish the grains and then you propagate the koji on the steamed grain. And the koji actually saccharify the grain. So it breaks the starches into simple sugars so that the yeast can then convert those sugars to alcohol.
So it acts as a diastase, basically.
That's right.
Now, I know this is quite complex chemistry, but it's breaking down it's breaking down into the alcohol, but the yeast comes on as well. So they work in tandem with each other.
That's right. It's a multiple parallel fermentation. So you have the koji working at the same time to break down the starches as the yeast is converting the sugars to alcohol. It's happening in the same fermentation.
Now, when you look at the stats for this, now it takes a long fermentation. Normally a fermentation in whiskey is between sort of 2 and 4 days. And at the end of it, you end up with your ABV is sort of 7 to 10, sort of maximum. The koji and the yeast working sort of side by side creates something totally different from that.
That's right. That's right. Typically the fermentations it's actually a two-stage fermentation. The first fermentation, what we usually refer to as the primary fermentation, is 100% koji inoculated grain.
Mm-hmm.
And then you will actually add steamed grain to the second fermentation without inoculating any more koji, because the koji will still be active in the fermentation and will start to break down the new grain. And you're basically feeding it again. You're giving it a new food source to continue the process. And the whole thing can take 2 to 3 weeks, depending on which style is being made.
So it's up to 3 week fermentation. Now, at the end of this, your wort that's running off, instead of it being 7 to 10%,
it's 18 to 19%.
I mean, that's basically what most distillers get after they do their first run. That's basically the ABV of a low wines. So you're getting that prior to actually distilling. You're at 20% almost already.
That's right.
Now your process that you take after that, you double distill.
That's right. It's a little bit strange, and it has everything to do with Japanese regulatory standards. But that 19% alcohol fermentation is single distilled in a pot still, and then that, which is about 45% alcohol, is diluted back down to 20% with spring water.
Okay.
To get it, and then it's redistilled. Then it's
redistilled,
and then it's back up to approximately 45% alcohol, and that's when it's casked. That's when it's put in a barrel.
It's a very strange process for what we are looking at. But I mean, the Tagamine process, there's other people who have used this to make other spirits, and they're reaching, after double distillation, in the high 80%. It seems a very efficient way of converting your grain to alcohol.
That's right. It's, I believe, 2 to 3 times more efficient to use koji to saccharify grains rather than malting. When one of these fermentations is finished, it's essentially liquefied. The grains are liquefied. You don't have any residual grain.
Yeah.
So you're basically extracting as much of the sugar as you can. That's right.
Yeah, everything goes. Now, Tagamine himself, he came from, as you say, a sake background, so he understood fermentation, which more and more, I think lots of people are beginning to realize that fermentation is really the key to all your flavors, because that's where all your flavors created. Everything else is really just additional and addition and subtraction. But he understood fermentation, and he went to the US to do this experiment. Now, I do love the fact that it's called the Manhattan Distillery, but it's based in Illinois. A little bit of marketing. But he went to the US, and tell me a bit about Tagamine, because he's a very interesting character.
He is. He was actually the son of a samurai physician, and
so he was busy.
and his mother came from the sake making family. Now, when he was a child, the entire old system of government was ended. So his father lost his status as a samurai. Fortunately, because he was a physician, he could continue to make a living for the family. Well, a lot of samurai couldn't. But Tagamine ended up becoming very well educated. He was one of the first graduates of the engineering college at Tokyo University, which today is considered by many people to be the best university in Asia. Mm-hmm. And he ended up working for the government, as a lot of the bright young Japanese were doing at the time. And he was sent on a trade mission to America to go to the New Orleans World's Fair in 1884. And while there, he met and fell in love with an American woman. And he then had to come back to Japan. He had his responsibilities. And what he realized is, if I want this dream of marrying this woman and having a life with her, I really need to become financially independent. And he ended up starting a company to make fertilizer.
Yeah.
And then his mother-in-law, actually, apparently his in-laws really approved of the marriage. And they can, so much so after the couple got married and moved back to Japan, within 3 years, they were back in the States. Yeah. They had been coaxed back to the US by the in-laws, who saw the financial potential of this young man because he was so talented as an engineer and as a chemist. And he ended up, he had all sorts of patents, and they're all, a lot of them are around Koji. He actually made a stomach aid, a digestive aid, because Koji creates amylase and protease, and so it breaks down both proteins and carbohydrates. So if you're a little upset stomach, you took one of these pills, and you'd feel a little bit better.
It sounds a bit like milk of magnesia, which was invented in Belfast.
Blue bottles, that was invented in Belfast. But no, he was the first person to isolate adrenaline.
That's right. That was his biggest contribution to really the world. I mean, adrenaline is a hugely important medical treatment even today. It saved countless lives.
Absolutely.
And it was actually the first time that a hormone had been isolated, that a pure hormone had been isolated in the history of medicine.
Yeah.
So he also paved the way for all of the future scientists and physicians who learned how to do that.
Yeah, I mean,
so
he
was really a remarkable man.
He was a remarkable man. He one of his big things, obviously done a bit of background for this. He really wanted to foster Japanese-American relations, probably on the same personal level. He wanted to make it a national thing, and the cherry blossom trees in Washington D.C. are world famous. You know, you see pictures of them all the time and various things, and he was instrumental in getting those planted.
That's right. He actually made that donation. He didn't want to do it directly as a private citizen, so he worked through the Japanese embassy, but those actually were financed by him and some of his pals in the Nippon Club, which is a private gentleman's club in Manhattan. Actually, the Manhattan, New York City, which he had moved to.
Not the fake Manhattan that he set up in Illinois.
That's right.
But he was so well respected that the Japanese emperor essentially gave him a palace.
Well, he did. Actually, that's right. So the St. Louis World's Fair, they had a pavilion, and there was this gorgeous, traditionally made Japanese, essentially summer palace that was part of the Japanese pavilion. And when the St. Louis World's Fair ended, that was gifted to Jokichi Tagamine, and he moved it to upstate New York, which it still exists today.
Wow.
So there's a Japanese palace in New York from a guy who basically made fungus in the alcohol. That's a great story. It's a great story. It's fabulous.